Republican Congressman Chris Collins says that he will not be running for re-election this fall. The decision comes as the New York lawmaker faces charges of conspiracy, securities and wire fraud, and making false statements to the FBI. Collins is also accused of insider trading related to an Australian pharmaceutical company. He sits on that company's board and was its top shareholder. So with more on the ethical questions that is now being raised, Richard Lardner joins me now. He's a reporter for the Associated Press, and he joins me from Washington. So, Richard, when this story broke last week, the first thing I thought was, isn't it inherently a conflict of interest for a lawmaker to sit on the board of a company and also be the #1 shareholder? It's legal, though.
It sure would. It just seems odd at a minimum, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people were very surprised when they found out that he was on the board and that he was such a large shareholder. And it's not that members of Congress don't own stock or have business interests, but to serve on the board of a publicly traded company is something I think a lot of people found surprising, but it is not against House rules as long as the member does not receive compensation, any form of compensation for doing so.
But why aren't stocks a form of compensation?
Well, it all depends on, one of Collins's defenses, and by the way, we should note that he is denied any wrongdoing. Right. And intends to fight these charges. He had said on the day in question, when information was allegedly passed to his son and then on to, other people who allegedly benefited, that he didn't trade a single share of stock. Mm-hmm. These things are, they're under focus now because when an episode like this sort of jumps to the front pages, it just grabs everyone's attention. I think it's important to note Congress is they have they can be pretty good at telling people what to do, but then not following that same advice themselves. Right. Most senior level executive branch officials are barred from serving on a board. And most people can understand why, but for members of the House, that's at least not now a prohibition. Congress has also exempted itself from the Freedom of Information Act, the federal open records law that applies to all executive branch agencies, but not to Congress. When things like this happen and we dig into the details, it certainly, I think, surprises people what how the rules can differ from depending on where you stand. Right.
I also thought to myself, doesn't a congressman have enough to do? He's got to add being on the board of a company. Usually, the expectation is perhaps after you are no longer serving, maybe that's a perk that you get appointed to a board, but while you're actually serving?
Yeah, I mean that's a very good point, and it was raised. Someone I talked to last week, a former general counsel of the House, noting that being a member of Congress is a full-time job. It's 24/7, and even to the extent that being on a board is not a full-time job. It's a potential distraction. Mm-hmm. that can take you away from what you were elected for.
But Collins was already the subject of an ethics investigation, right?
Well, yeah, the Office of Congressional Ethics had looked into some of his shareholdings and whether or not there was anything improper. And I believe that the OCE, the Congressional Ethics Office, found that he had not followed House rules and standards of conduct. But I don't believe the House Ethics Committee, I'm not sure what they ultimately determined on that front. And then, of course, we had the indictment last week, mm-hmm. which, takes it to a whole new level.
Indeed. There are two other New York lawmakers that say they plan to introduce legislation that would actually update the House rules. What would those rules look like, and how is Congress expected to respond to that proposal?
That's a good question. So Kathleen Rice, a Democrat, Tom Reed, a Republican, both from New York, coincidentally, say they plan to introduce this legislation. What it would basically do is conform House rules to mirror Senate rules. In the Senate, senators are not allowed to be on the board of a publicly traded company. Even that Senate rule has been pointed out is not necessarily ironclad. Because it presumably leaves open the ability to serve on the board of a 501c, which is a charitable organization, some sort of a nonprofit. But some of these groups, like 501c4s, as they're known, social welfare organizations, they can sort of be involved in politics to a certain degree, as long as it's not their primary focus. They can accept money from unnamed. They don't have to name their donors. I think as this moves forward, you'll hear voices pushing for, I think, more restrictive language for both chambers to adopt.
Yeah, I can totally see that. Richard Lardner, thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you.